The envelope is on her desk. She has not opened it. She made coffee she did not drink, and answered 2 letters she will have to rewrite, because she cannot think about anything except the typeface visible through the open flap, a dropped E, a canted T, which she would know anywhere, because she spent 6 years reading it in manuscript. The machine belonged to Corwin Hale. Corwin Hale has been dead for 2 years. She is standing in the kitchen doorway. The postmark reads yesterday. The last line of type visible through the open flap is a sentence she has not yet thought to write. Hello, and welcome to Midnight Pages. I'm David, your host, here with you from Ohio. Tonight's story is one I've been sitting with for a while, waiting until I thought I understood it well enough to tell it right. It is a story about authorship, about whose name goes on the cover of a book when the person who actually wrote it has been dead for 2 years, about what it costs to build a name, and who pays when the name outlives the person who earned it. Here is the question I want to ask you before we begin. If someone wrote the book that made you who you are, wrote it for you, in secret, by agreement, would the name on the cover be a lie? I want to know what you think. Leave your answer in the comments. I'll be reading everyone. Now the manuscript is on the desk. Let's read it. Chapter 1. The Client Who Wouldn't Sit Down. Adela Vane arrived at the brownstone on West 35th Street at 9:47 on a Tuesday morning in October. That meant she arrived while Nero Wolfe was upstairs in his orchid rooms on the roof, and I was on my own downstairs with a cup of coffee and no particular illusions about the day ahead. I knew who she was before she said her name. I'd read 2 of her books, the Ravenswood mysteries, the ones with the clever woman barrister who solves murders between court sessions in London. And I had the author photograph from the dust jacket of the Ravenswood Gambit somewhere in the back of my memory. That photograph had been taken in an English garden, with soft sunlight, climbing roses, and the serene expression of a woman who possessed all the time in the world. The woman now standing in our front hallway looked like the same person after the garden had been leveled by a bulldozer, and after she had spent several weeks pretending she hadn't noticed the debris. She was 50, give or take 2 years. She wore a dark wool coat of exceptional cut, cashmere and broadcloth, the sort of tailoring that costs 3 weeks of a working detective's salary and announces itself without making a scene. But she was holding the coat over her left forearm rather than wearing it or letting Fritz hang it on the rack, which told me she had arrived intending to state her business in 2 minutes and bolt, and was already beginning to realize she was going to be here much longer. Her dark hair had a single distinct streak of silver at the left temple that she had brushed back plainly. Her hands were long and slender, with the faint indigo shadow of fountain pen ink along the knuckle of her right forefinger. Working hands, but disciplined to the point of rigidity. When Fritz ushered her into the office, she crossed immediately to the red leather chair near the corner of my desk. Not the yellow chair, which sits squarely in front of Wolfe's blotter and invites an extended interrogation, but the red one, closer to the door. She sat on the front 2 inches of the cushion, her back straight as a ruler, her handbag balanced on her knees like a shield. I poured her coffee from the silver pot Fritz had brought in on the morning tray, set it on the small table beside her elbow, and looked at the wall clock. Mr. Wolfe is on the roof with Theodore Horstman, I told her. From 9 to 11 in the morning and from 4 to 6 in the afternoon, he tends orchids. He does not take telephone calls, he does not sign checks, and he would not come down if the Metropolitan Museum caught fire and floated down the Hudson. You have 13 minutes. If you want to spend them drinking coffee and catching your breath, that's fine. If you want to tell me what's keeping you on the edge of that chair, that's better. She looked at the coffee cup, then up at me. Her gray eyes were remarkably clear, but there was a tight, white tension around the corners of her mouth that no amount of cosmetic composure could disguise. Mr. Goodwin, she said, and her voice had the low, measured timbre of someone who had spent decades training herself never to sound hysterical in public. I called yesterday because I believed I was losing my mind. This morning I am fairly certain I am not losing my mind, which is considerably worse. That's usually how it works, I said. Start with the envelope. She opened her handbag, took out a folded sheet of typing paper, and laid it on my desk. 3 weeks ago, she said, I received 12 pages in the morning mail. They were typed on heavy bond. They contained 3 chapters of my novel in progress, a book entitled The Silent Docket. When they arrived, I had only completed chapter 4 in my own manuscript. The pages I received began at chapter 7 and continued through chapter 9. They contained plot developments, dialogue, and specific clues involving an antique pocket watch that I had conceived in my head, but had not yet typed or shared with a living soul. I looked at the sheet. You thought it was a trick. I thought I had talked in my sleep. I thought I had left rough notes in a taxi. I thought of every pathetic rationalizing excuse a frightened writer manufactures when reality fails to conform to logic. I locked the pages in my desk drawer and tried to write chapter 5. But yesterday morning, a second envelope arrived. Her voice didn't waver, but her fingers tightened on the strap of her bag until the lever groaned. It contained 21 more pages, the murder scene at the auction house. And this time, I looked at the typeface through a magnifying glass. The letter E is misaligned. It drops nearly 2 millimeters below the line. The crossbar of the letter T is canted upward at a sharp 5-degree angle, throwing a shadow on the paper. I know that machine, Mr. Goodwin. I spent 6 years reading manuscripts produced on that exact keyboard. Whose machine? I asked. Corwin Hale's, she said softly, my longtime collaborator, the man who helped me construct every Ravenswood novel since 1948. And where is Mr. Hale? Corwin died 2 years ago this November, Adela Vane said, a coronary thrombosis in his apartment on West 50th Street. The medical examiner signed the certificate, the church held the service, and I attended his burial in Queens. Yet yesterday morning, someone sat at his desk, struck his keys, and wrote 21 pages of my book that only Corwin Hale could have conceived. I picked up the sheet of typing paper. The paper was standard 20-pound bond, slightly rough around the edges, where it had been torn from a pad or cut from a larger ream. The ink was rich, dark ribbon ink, with the unmistakable purple undertone of commercial-grade black typewriter ribbon. Did Mr. Hale leave an estate? I asked. A secretary? An executor? A relative who cleaned out his apartment? He had an older sister, Adela said, Ruth Hale Connors. She lives in Riverdale. But Ruth never read his manuscripts, never understood his craft, and certainly couldn't construct a single page of detective fiction if her life depended on it. His apartment was cleared by a liquidator 2 months after the funeral. The furniture was sold at auction. The papers were boxed and delivered to his sister's garage. The typewriter was supposedly sold with the lot. Supposedly, I echoed. I called the liquidator on Monday, she said, her voice dropping lower. A man named Henderson on 4th Avenue. He checked his inventory books from 2 years ago. The Royal typewriter was never entered in the auction catalog. Someone bought it privately from Corwin's rooms before the public sale began. At precisely 11 o'clock, the private elevator behind the office door purred to a stop. The door slid open, and Nero Wolfe entered the room. He looked as massive, imperturbable, and thoroughly inconvenient as ever, dressed in his heavy brown wool suit, smelling faintly of osmunda fiber, damp peat, and charcoal smoke from the greenhouse heaters. He moved across the carpet with that silent, uncanny lightness that always catches strangers off guard, rounded the corner of his enormous mahogany desk, and lowered his 7/7 of a ton bulk into the custom chair. He did not glance at Adela Vane. He adjusted the desk blotter by 1/4 of an inch, picked up the paper knife, and looked at me with an expression of aggrieved endurance. Well, Archie? I gave him the whole story in 4 brisk minutes, the novel in progress, the dead collaborator, the dropped E, the impossible auction house scene, the missing typewriter, and the unopened envelope currently sitting on Miss Vane's writing desk. When I finished, Wolfe's eyes were half closed. His chin was sunk into the expanse of his neck. "Flummery," he muttered. "Ghostly typists do not exist, Miss Vane. The dead do not maintain correspondence with the living. Either you have engaged in an elaborate self-delusion to generate publicity, or you are the victim of a pedestrian parlor trick engineered by an associate who has stolen your notes. In neither case is my intervention warranted. Archie, return the lady's fee and show her out." Adela Vane did not flinch. She sat back in the red chair for the first time, her hands perfectly steady. "Mr. Wolfe," she said, "I have not offered a fee yet, because Mr. Goodwin has not named one. But I am prepared to pay $5,000 for 5 days of your time. And I am not self-deluded. I know precisely what I am asking." Wolfe didn't move an eyelash at the mention of $5,000, though I saw his left thumb twitch against the blotter. $5,000 pays for a great deal of beer, several hundred rare orchid bulbs from South America, and 3 months of Fritz's grocery accounts at the butcher. I leaned against the corner of my desk and caught his eye. "The way I see it," I said, "the lady isn't asking you to hold a séance. She's asking a straight procedural question. Who currently has physical access to Corwin Hale's personal royal typewriter, his private working drafts, and enough intimate knowledge of Adela Vane's literary cadence to forge pages that fool the woman whose name is on the copyright? That's not a ghost story, sir. That's a deliberate, calculated intellectual challenge aimed right at your front door. If you turn it down, you're going to spend the next 4 weeks staring at your Catalia hybrids, wondering who was clever enough to pull it off." Wolfe opened his eyes. He glared at me with that cold, ferocious stillness he reserves for moments when I have maneuvered him into a corner from which there is no dignified retreat. He sat motionless for 5 seconds, 10 seconds. Then he shifted his gaze to Adela Vane. "Miss Vane," Wolfe said, his voice dropping an octave into business register, "bring me every page of that manuscript before 4 o'clock today. Then find out who is currently paying the electric bill on West 50th Street." I took the check, gave Miss Vane our standard receipt, and filed the encounter under my favorite category: cases won by being thoroughly, systematically insufferable. Chapter 2. The signature on the page. Adela had brought the pages with her, both batches, clipped together and placed inside a manila folder that she'd been careful not to crease. She placed the folder on Wolfe's desk the way you set something down when you have carried it too long, relieved to finally have it off your hands. Wolfe did not touch it immediately. He looked at it, then he looked at me. "Read." I opened the folder and took out the first batch. 42 pages of typescript, standard 20-pound bond paper, not the cream-laid stock Adela used for her own drafts, which I knew because she had mentioned it and I had noted it. The typing was clean, mostly, except for places where the letter E had failed to strike cleanly, leaving gaps in words like the and before. The letter E dipped slightly below the baseline now and then, quietly, the way a man with a bad knee occasionally favors his left leg without thinking about it. I read aloud. Wolfe listened with his eyes closed. He does this when he wants to hear without looking, which is either a concentration technique or theater. After 15 years I've stopped trying to determine which. The passage was from deep inside what appeared to be Adela's novel in progress, a scene set at a fictional auction house in the East 50s, involving a rare book dealer and a questionable provenance. The writing had Adela's rhythm, the long sentences with the sharp pivot at the end, the particular way she used physical description to carry emotional weight. It was close. It was close enough that, had she received these pages as a first draft from a collaborator, she might have accepted them without comment. I stopped at the end of page 12 and looked at Adela. "The auction house layout," I said. "The back room with the false partition." She nodded. She was very still. "You've written that detail," I said. "I sketched it. In my notebook. I never typed it." He had not opened his eyes. I kept reading. On page 19, I found it. The character's name. Mrs. Aldrich stood at the door of the back room, her gloves folded in her right hand. I stopped. "Mrs. Aldrich," I said. "Is that right?" Adela looked at the page. "No, I changed her name. 3 weeks ago I changed it to Mrs. Fentham. I told Corwin on the phone." She said his name carefully, the way you say the name of someone you've been careful not to say. He was the only person I told. I noted this on my pad. Hale would have known the new name. Whoever wrote these pages knew the old one. I moved on. Page 26, a sentence that read, "The collection comprises 3 sections, distinguished not by period, but by provenance." I said, not looking up, "She comprises, where you'd say consists of." "I use it correctly," Adela said. "I always write consists of when describing components. Corwin used to argue with me about it over the telephone. He insisted comprises had more weight on the tongue." "I know," I said. "This is Hale's tick, apparently transplanted." I wrote it down and underlined it. It was a small thing. Writers have ticks. I noted it the way I note everything that seems small enough not to matter yet. At page 31, I set the pages down. The room was quiet. Somewhere above us, 3 floors up, Theodore Horseman was doing whatever Theodore Horseman does to orchids in the late morning. The only sounds were the faint distant traffic from 35th Street, and that heavy, deliberate silence that settles into Wolfe's office whenever he is thinking in private. "Look at the ribbon wear," Wolfe said, pointing a thick forefinger toward the top margin of page 4. The upper third of each capital letter is faint, while the baseline remains saturated. That indicates an uneven spool tension common in portable royals manufactured prior to 1942. A forger acquiring a random machine would clean the type bars and install a fresh ribbon. The person who typed these pages used a machine that has sat in the same room with the same ribbon spool deteriorating at a natural rate for 24 months. I leaned over the desk to look. The purple-black ink showed exactly what he described, a faint, dusty graying along the tops of the ascenders, while the bottoms bit deep into the bond. "Which means," I said, "it isn't just the same make and model. It's the physical machine from West 50th Street, operated by someone who didn't even bother to change the ribbon Corwin Hale left in the carriage." "Precisely," Wolfe said, "a machine kept as a relic, not as a tool of deception." I said, "The auction house sketch. She sketched it, never typed it. Nobody should have that detail." Wolfe lifted his heavy lids. He directed his gaze toward the ceiling for a moment, then shifted it to me. "Mr. Goodwin, whom do we know who is currently paying the rent on Corwin Hale's apartment on West 50th Street?" "Nobody, presumably. He's been dead 2 years." "Then find out who is presumably nobody." He picked up his book. "Ask Mr. Durkin to pull the lease records. Today if it's convenient for him. Tomorrow if it is not." He opened to his page. "And tell Fritz I'll have the beer now. It is closer to noon than I was expecting." I looked at the pages on the desk. The telltale dipped letter E, the tilted letter T, the old character name. Mrs. Aldrich, not Mrs. Fentham. I should mention one other thing about those pages, because I almost didn't mention it at all, and it matters later. There was a moment, reading page 31, when Adela made a sound, not a word. It was something between a breath and a word. The sound a person makes when a blow they have been bracing for finally lands, and they realize the bracing did not help at all. I looked up. She had one hand flat on the arm of the red chair, very still, and she was looking at the page in my hand. I said, "What is it?" She said, "Nothing. Keep reading." I kept reading, but I noted it, not on my pad, but in the way I note things that I don't yet have a category for. The collection comprises 3 sections. The auction house layout from her private notebook, Mrs. Aldrich's wrong name, and that sound at the end of page 31, which I filed without a label and left to season. The trick with an impossible thing is not to declare it impossible. Wolfe had a line about this he deployed maybe twice a year, usually when I was about to make the mistake of concluding something couldn't be true because I couldn't explain it. He would say, "Examine what is true, Mr. Goodwin. The explanation for how it is true will follow." He said this the way other people say "of course," as though the point were so obvious that stating it was almost condescending. What was true? Someone had Hale's typewriter. Someone had read Adela's notebooks. Someone knew the old character name and had not been told about the change. I closed the folder and went to find Fred Durkin. Chapter 3. The Man Who Died Alone. Fred Durkin is not the brightest operative I've ever worked with, but he is thorough, in the way a good hunting dog is thorough. He will not come back until he has found the thing he was sent for, and when he finds it, he brings it back whole. He called me at 10 the next morning with the lease information on Corwin Hale's apartment. The lease had been paid forward 6 months at the time of death, which Fred described as unusual. The building superintendent, a man named Kravitz, had confirmed that someone still came by occasionally to collect the mail. Fred had not pressed. I told him to leave it there for now and look into the death certificate instead. I had other business that morning. I was going to see Lon Cohen. Lon Cohen has worked the city desk at the Gazette for going on 12 years, which means he knows everyone in New York who has ever done anything worth printing, and a fair number of people who have done things nobody wants to print, but everybody wants to know. He is a small man with large eyes, and the relaxed demeanor of someone who never had any illusions about New York, which has spared him a great deal of disappointment. He also owes me approximately 14 favors, depending on how you count, and I had a 15th ready to offer him. I walked into his corner of the city room at 11:15. The room was loud with the clatter of 30 typewriters, teletype machines drumming against paper, and the smell of stale coffee and paste-pot glue that has been the trademark odor of American journalism since the Civil War. Lon was sitting with his feet on a stack of early editions, dealing himself a hand of gin rummy. "Archie," he said without looking up from his cards, "if Wolfe wants me to suppress a story about an orchid theft, tell him the answer is $20 and a bottle of whatever Fritz put up in August." "Nobody stole an orchid," I said, pulling up a chair and moving a bundle of galleys out of the way. "I'm offering you exclusive rights on the biggest publishing scandal to hit Midtown since the Dreiser lawsuit, but you have to sit on it until we wrap the case." Lon laid his cards down, his sharp little eyes focused on mine. "Who's the target?" "Frost and Halliday, specifically the Ravenswood brand." Lon let out a soft whistle through his teeth. "Adela Vane? That's heavy timber, Archie. Frost prints money with those books. What's the angle?" "Tell me about Corwin Hale first." Hale had been a fixture in a particular stratum of the New York literary world, the working writers, the ones who produced steadily and well, and did not appear at parties because they were home writing the next book. He had published 3 novels of his own in the early 40s, well reviewed and modestly sold, and had then, so far as the public record was concerned, gone quiet. Lon had heard the ghostwriting at second or third hand. It was the kind of open secret that exists in a world small enough that everyone knows it, but formal enough that no one says it. Hale wrote the Ravenswood books. Adela Vane provided the name, the story ideas, the biography of a real author. Between them, they had produced 4 bestsellers and a substantial royalty stream, split by arrangement. "What kind of arrangement?" I said. "The kind nobody writes down," Lon said, "which is the only kind that lasts in publishing. Once you put it on paper, lawyers get involved. Once lawyers get involved, everybody loses." Lon pushed his chair back and led me down the narrow iron spiral stairs into the Gazette's morgue. 2 basement floors, of floor-to-ceiling metal filing cabinets that smelled of decaying newsprint, vinegar, and 70 years of forgotten Manhattan scandals. An elderly clerk with green eye shades pulled a manila folder labeled "Literary Estates Unprobated." Inside were clipping files on half a dozen anonymous hacks who had written best-selling romance and adventure series under Society Women's bylines in the 20s and 30s. "It's an old racket, Archie," Lon said, tapping a yellowed clipping from 1934. "A publisher finds a pretty face for the book jackets, and a broken-down newspaperman to do the typing in a cold-water flat on 10th Avenue. The publisher gets the prestige, the lady gets the cocktail parties, and the hack gets $50 a week and an early grave." Hale was smarter than most. He demanded a percentage. But the ending is always the same. The name on the cover survives, and the man who wrote the words disappears. He also knew the name R. Strand. He'd reviewed one of the Cormorant Press novellas in a capsule for the Sunday book page, a slim crime story, very clean, with a particular gift for the mechanics of deception. He'd thought it was good. He'd never connected it to Hale. "Should I have?" Lon said. "Maybe," I said. "I'll tell you when I know." Fred called back at 3. The death certificate was exactly what Adela had described. Cardiac arrest, 54 years old, unwitnessed, no autopsy requested. The certificate had been signed by a Dr. Elwood Marsh, general practice, West Side. The case had been closed in 24 hours. Something about a lease paid 6 months forward and a man nobody thought to look at twice. I filed it as planted doubt and left it there. The case was not about whether Hale had really died. The case was about what he had left behind when he did. What I did know, Lon Cohen had heard the Cormorant Press name. The building on West 50th still had someone picking up the mail, and a dead man's typewriter was producing chapters of an unfinished novel. I should say something about Corwin Hale's reputation, because it matters for what comes after, and I did not understand it fully until Lon explained it to me over his second cup of coffee, with the expression of a man who has covered the literary world long enough to find it neither glamorous nor surprising. The Ravenswood books had made Adela Vane. Before them, she had published one novel of her own, a perfectly respectable book, sold modestly, reviewed kindly, and then quietly forgotten in the way of books that are perfectly respectable. Then the Ravenswood series began, and suddenly there was a voice on the page that hadn't quite been there before. Sharper, more assured, the kind of authority that comes, Lon said, from knowing exactly what you're doing and why. "And you think Hale was responsible for that shift?" I said. "I think," Lon said with some care, "that the question of what Adela Vane contributed to those books is a genuinely complicated one. She had the ideas, she had the characters, she had the life of a woman who has thought hard about the world and has opinions about it. What she didn't have, or didn't trust herself to have, was the sentence. Hale gave her that. A man who gives someone their sentence is not a small thing. A man who gives someone their style and then dies leaves a dangerous vacuum behind. The problem of what happens to that voice once he is gone never truly announces itself until the next contract comes due." I drove back to the brownstone with the windows down. The city smelled of October and exhaust, and the faint edge of something burning from somewhere on the west side that I did not investigate. I had enough to investigate. I went back to the brownstone and reported to Wolfe. He listened with his eyes closed, his fingers laced across the front of his waistcoat. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment. "Mr. Durkin is to pursue the mail collection," he said, discreetly. "I want to know who retrieves it, and when, and from where they come." He opened his eyes and looked at me. "I want Saul as well. Saul Panzer costs twice what Fred does, and is worth 4 times as much." I called him from the hall. Chapter 4. What Frost Knew. Fritz made a Basque omelette for my breakfast before I left for Midtown the next morning. This is relevant because, on cases where Wolfe does not eat with me, Fritz compensates by cooking as if he does. The omelette had piquillo peppers and manchego folded into it, and Fritz had browned the edges in the pan the way he does when he is feeling particular about texture. And the yolk was still soft and moving when I cut through it. The pepper was sweet and faintly smoky from the roasting. I ate it standing at the kitchen counter, because I was in a hurry, and Fritz disapproved of this on principle, and said nothing, which is how he expresses very strongly held opinions about things that are not his jurisdiction. I told him it was magnificent. He said, "Of course." He meant the kitchen, the stove, the pan, the pepper, all of it. An entire philosophy of cooking contained in 2 words. I left in a better humor than I'd arrived in, which is generally what Fritz is aiming for. Edgar Frost ran Frost & Halliday from a corner suite on the 42nd floor of a 6th Avenue tower. It communicated wealth the way Midtown buildings in 1954 always did. Quietly, with carpeting so deep it felt like walking across a damp putting green. His secretary had good posture, glasses on a silver chain, and an expression that said she had met a great many people who thought they were more important than they were, and had developed a reliable, polite system for dismantling them. She showed me into the corner office after an 11-minute wait that had been calculated with a slide rule. Frost was a big man, 58 or 60, the kind who had probably rowed crew at Princeton 30 years earlier, and had spent the intervening decades maintaining his bulk with 4 martini lunches and expensive cigars. He had the desk of a man who likes to be separated from the people he talks to by an ocean of polished walnut, flanked by framed original dust jackets and leather-bound sales ledgers that looked like sacred texts. He shook my hand across the expanse without getting up. "Goodwin," he said, indicating a leather armchair with a wave of his gold lighter. "I agreed to see you because Nero Wolfe's name still carries some weight in this town, even if his methods belong to the 19th century. But I have a board meeting at 11:30, so let's keep the dramatics to a minimum." I sat. "I'm looking into a matter connected to the Adela Vane novels." His face did something careful and controlled when I mentioned her name, the way a banker's face does when an auditor mentions a ledger that was supposed to be in storage. He said, "I've always found Adela to be one of our most reliable and lucrative authors. The Ravenswood series is currently printed in 9 languages. We've sold 300,000 hardcovers this year alone." "Reliable is an interesting word," I said. "Lucrative is even better. Tell me about Corwin Hale." There was a pause. Not a long one, for he was far too experienced for an amateur flinch. But his hand hovered over the silver cigarette box on his blotter for 2 full seconds before picking up a Panatella. "Corwin Hale was a fine writer," Frost said smoothly. "A tragedy, his passing. A real loss to the industry. He contributed to several house projects here in various developmental capacities." "Various capacities," I said. "Such as writing the books Adela Vane puts her name on?" Frost didn't blink. He clipped the end of his cigar with a gold cutter. "Mr. Goodwin, publishing is an intricate machinery. Editorial consultation, structural revision, line polishing, these are standard behind-the-scenes collaborations. They are not matters of public record, nor should they be. The reading public buys an image, an author, a persona. Adela Vane is that persona." And Hale was the typewriter. "The Vane brand comprises 4 major titles and a very devoted readership," Frost said, leaning forward and tapping the desk with the flat of his lighter. "Whatever private arrangements existed between Miss Vane and Mr. Hale were their own affair. My concern is the contract, the sales figures, and the protection of an asset that generates $500,000 a year for this house. If someone is threatening that asset, I expect Mr. Wolfe to neutralize the threat, not manufacture a scandal." I wrote it down on my pad, underlined it twice. "Neutralizing threats is our specialty," I said, putting the pencil away. "Thanks for the cigar smoke." I took the elevator down 42 floors, walked out into the cool 6th Avenue breeze, and called the brownstone from a phone booth across from Radio City. I told Wolfe, "Frost knows about the ghostwriting, has known for years. He didn't send the pages. His entire empire rests on keeping the ghost in the grave. But he knows." Wolfe said, "What were his exact words regarding the titles?" I checked my pad. He said, "The Vane brand comprises 4 major titles and a very devoted readership." There was a long silence over the wire. Then Wolfe said, "He said comprises." "Yes, verbatim." "Mr. Goodwin, note that word carefully. It is either an infection he caught from reading Hale's drafts, or an explicit stylistic directive that was circulated. We will determine which. Return to the office. Saul has telephoned. He has located the second lease." I came back to the brownstone, took the 3 stone steps to the stoop, 2 at a time, and walked into the office. Wolfe was seated at his desk with a glass of Remmers, examining a sheet of paper. "Report in full," Wolfe said. I sat at my desk, opened my notebook, and gave him Frost's exact phrases, the corporate bluster, the 300,000 hardcovers, the 4 martini posture, and the specific way Frost had stiffened when Hale's name entered the conversation. When I finished, Wolfe was silent for a full minute, turning his beer glass between his broad palms. "Fascinating," Wolfe murmured. "Frost is a predator of commerce, Archie. He does not read books for aesthetic pleasure. He reads them for profit. If he uses the word comprises incorrectly, he did not invent the error. He adopted it because it appeared in the drafts submitted to his editorial department, and because he concluded, with the lazy arrogance of a publisher, that whatever sold 300,000 copies must be acceptable English. Which leaves us, I said, with the question of who taught it to the sender. "Exactly so," Wolfe said. "Saul will be here at 5. Let us see what Brooklyn has yielded." I closed my notebook, poured myself a glass of milk from the refrigerator in the kitchen, and waited for Saul. Chapter 5. What Saul Found. Saul Panzer arrived at the brownstone at 10 minutes to 5. He found the front door unlocked, and me sitting in the hall with a glass of water and nothing to do, because Wolfe had gone up to the orchid rooms at 4 o'clock sharp, and would not come down before 6. This is non-negotiable. It has been non-negotiable for as long as I've worked for Wolfe, and it will remain non-negotiable until one of them stops functioning. And given that the orchids are under Theodore Horseman's care, and Theodore Horseman treats them with the solemnity of a man guarding a very small nation, I expect the orchid rooms to outlast all of us. Saul sat in the front room and ate a ham sandwich he had brought in a paper bag, because Saul plans for contingencies the way other people breathe, and he had known there was a reasonable chance he'd be waiting. I pretended to read a copy of the Saturday Evening Post. It was last month's. I read the same paragraph 4 times. At 6:02, Wolfe came downstairs, looked at Saul, looked at me, and sat down. "Well," he said. Saul put the paper bag down and took out his notebook. He has a particular way of reporting that strips everything to what matters. Other operatives tell you the story. Saul gives you the facts in the order in which they become important. The apartment was at 447 Cornelia Street in Brooklyn, 4th floor, Unit B, leased under the name C. Hale Strand, a name that appeared on no other document Saul had been able to locate, which suggested it was constructed rather than inherited. The superintendent had opened right up after Saul posed as a prospective tenant, spending 20 casual minutes in the lobby, asking harmless questions about the building. The unit Saul had established contained a writing desk with a typewriter. He had not entered the unit. He had, however, examined the typewriter through the window of the 4th floor landing, which gave a partial view of the desk, and had confirmed the same mechanical signature. The misaligned letter E was visible even from the landing, on a piece of paper left in the carriage. A shelf in the unit held a row of paperback novellas, Cormorant Press, Greenwich Village, all under the name R. Strand. And in the building's mailroom, addressed to C. Hale Strand, Saul had found, with the superintendent's unknowing cooperation, a return envelope from R. Strand to C. Hale Strand at the Cornelia Street address. The same person, writing to himself. "The carbon copy," Wolfe said. Saul produced it from his inside jacket pocket, folded in thirds. He had photographed it at a shop on Atlantic Avenue, and replaced the original. He opened it and read the key passage. Corwin Hale's voice, deliberate and precise, instructing someone named Miles in the matter of the Vane series, the continuation of the arrangement, and the importance of maintaining consistency in what Hale described as house style. The word comprises appeared in the letter. Hale had underlined it. He had written in the margin, "Use this. She won't catch it. It reads as character." A heavy silence settled over the office, while Wolfe digested the paragraph. Wolfe said, "Mr. Panzer, you have done well." He looked at me. "I will need to see Miss Vane again. And I will need Fritz to retype something for me tomorrow morning." He reached for his beer. "Who is Miles?" "Not a last name in the letter," Saul said. "No, of course not." Wolfe looked at the ceiling. "Mr. Goodwin, find him." I said, "Any guidance on where to start?" Wolfe, Corwin Hale's world, the people who admired his work, the young ones particularly. He drank. He would have chosen someone devoted, someone who would not talk, someone who understood what was at stake. I looked at the carbon copy. C. Hale Strand. A name assembled from two names, the way a life can be assembled from two lives, if the person doing the assembling is careful enough. I should note that the R. Strand novellas were sitting on my mind in a particular way. Lon Cohen had reviewed one. I had not read any of them. I went out the next morning, before Wolfe's Orchid schedule began, and found one at a second-hand shop on 8th Avenue. A slim paperback, with a plain green cover and the title, The Careful Arrangement. I read the first chapter on a stool at a counter lunch, while I had a cup of coffee and a piece of pie I didn't need. The writing was very clean, economical, the kind of prose that does not show its work, which is the only kind worth reading if you have something better to do with your time than admire the machinery. A clean, three-part structure, a mystery that earned its solution without cheating. The voice had something in it, something considered and unhurried, that reminded me of something I could not immediately place. I left the book at the lunch counter and went to find Miles. The literary circle around Corwin Hale was tight enough that asking a few targeted questions produced a solid lead in less than a day. Fred Durkin located a Miles Brandt through a contact at the Columbia Writing Program, where Brandt had audited seminars there 2 years earlier, during the period when Hale was still alive. An instructor remembered him, quiet, devoted to Hale's published work, had written a long essay on Hale's craft for the program newsletter, had published, the instructor recalled, some short work in small magazines, had a place in Brooklyn. I noted the Brooklyn address. It was in Carroll Gardens. The postal zone matched the postmark on Batch 2. I hadn't received Batch 2 yet, but when I did, I would check. Saul went home. I sat in the office while Wolfe read, which meant he ignored me on principle, while I sat at my desk, thinking about a young man named Miles, who had spent 2 years playing ghost for a dead writer. Chapter 6. The Inspector's Opinion. Kramer arrived the next morning at 9:50 with Sergeant Pearlie Stebbins behind him, which is how Kramer always arrives when he wants to make a point about the weight and annoyance of law enforcement. Stebbins is a massive, granite-faced sergeant who communicates authority through the medium of sheer physical volume, and I have always suspected Kramer brings him specifically because our front hallway is not enormous, and Stebbins standing in it makes the brownstone feel like it's being surrounded by the 6th Precinct. I showed them into the office. Wolfe was at his desk with a book on ancient numismatics and a fresh bottle of Remmers. He closed the book when they came in, placed a marker carefully between the leaves, but did not move it off his blotter, which was his exact way of signaling that their presence was an interruption of something far more significant. "Inspector," Wolfe said, leaning back, "you have come in person, and you have brought Mr. Stebbins. That implies either a catastrophe in the city's administration or a misunderstanding you wish to magnify." Kramer dropped into the red leather chair, pulled an unlit cigar from his vest pocket, and stuck it in the corner of his mouth without lighting it. He glared at Wolfe, with 30 years of accumulated homicide experience. "Cut the vocabulary, Wolfe," Kramer snapped. You know a woman named Adela Vane. I know of her. She is a client. What's the case? A private literary dispute, Wolfe said, entirely civil. Nothing that falls within the jurisdiction of the New York Police Department. Is that so? Kramer leaned forward, chewing the end of his cigar. Then why did Ruth Hale Connors, sister of the late Corwin Hale, call the district attorney's office yesterday afternoon, claiming she'd received threatening, extortionate mail at her house in Riverdale? Wolfe's eyebrows rose a fraction of an inch. Did she characterize it as extortionate? She said someone was sending her typed manuscript chapters that proved her brother's estate was being robbed. She was hysterical. She gave the desk sergeant 3 different names, tried to retract all of them, and then dropped the name Miles Brandt before hanging up. Pearlie went up to Riverdale this morning. The woman refused to open the door, but her maid said a messenger delivered an envelope from Brooklyn on Tuesday. Kramer pointed a thick, blunt finger across the desk. Now, Wolfe, I know Adela Vane came here on Tuesday. I know Corwin Hale was her collaborator before he dropped dead 2 years ago. And I know you don't take cases for $500 retainers unless there's something big enough underneath to pay for Fritz's truffles. If somebody murdered Corwin Hale 2 years ago and you're sitting on evidence of a homicide to collect a private fee, I'll have your license suspended before dinner. Wolfe's gaze grew very cold. Inspector, Wolfe said with quiet, devastating precision. Corwin Hale died of coronary thrombosis, certified by an accredited physician and confirmed by public record. No homicide occurred. No crime of violence has been committed, contemplated, or concealed. The manuscript pages represent an extended, highly peculiar literary fraud conducted with the explicit prior consent of the deceased. There is nothing here for a grand jury, nothing for a criminal docket, and nothing that warrants your presence in this room. Then who is Miles Brandt? Kramer demanded. A young man whose identity and role will be made entirely clear in this office within 48 hours, Wolfe replied. All interested parties will be seated in those chairs. At that time, Mr. Stebbins may sit in the corner and record their statements. Until then, you have my assurance. No life is in jeopardy. No felony has occurred, and you are wasting the city's gasoline. Kramer stared at him, grinding his teeth against the cigar. He knew Wolfe well enough to know that when Wolfe offered a 48-hour guarantee on a room full of suspects, pushing harder only resulted in Wolfe ringing for beer and reading his book in silence. Kramer stood up, jerked his coat straight, and nodded at Stebbins. 48 hours, Wolfe, Kramer growled. Not 48 hours and 10 minutes. If I don't get a full accounting by Friday evening, I'm bringing the DA's squad with me. Fritz, Wolfe called calmly. The front door. The moment the front door closed behind them, Fritz stepped into the office, holding a square manila envelope. This arrived with the 11 o'clock carrier, sir, Fritz said. Postmarked Brooklyn. I took the envelope, sliced the flap with the silver paper knife, and drew out batch 2. 21 pages of crisp typescript. The auction house murder scene. I laid the pages on my desk and checked the typeface under my pocket glass. The misaligned letter E struck 2 millimeters below the line. The tilted letter T threw its sharp northeast shadow. On page 14, the word comprises appeared twice in 3 paragraphs. And on page 18, there was the metaphor. A cut crystal decanter, described as perfectly calibrated, like everything Hale valued, to do its work without calling attention to itself. The postal zone matches Carroll Gardens, I told Wolfe, and the metaphor on page 18 is verbatim from Adela Vane's first novel, the one she wrote before she met Hale. Wolfe nodded slowly, his fingers tapping a slow rhythm against his waistcoat. Call Miss Vane, Wolfe instructed. Ask her if Corwin Hale ever mentioned a pupil named Miles Brandt. Her answer will complete the premise. I called. When I read Adela the line about the decanter, she didn't speak for nearly a minute. Corwin quoted that line to me on the day we agreed to work together, she whispered. He told me that was the standard we had to meet. Did he ever mention Miles Brandt? I asked. Once, she said, her voice shaking slightly. He said he had found a young writer who could mirror any prose style in the English language with 10 days of practice. He called him his insurance policy. I hung up the receiver and looked across at Wolfe. That's a cold way to describe a human being. Mr. Hale was facing mortality, Wolfe said. Dying men are rarely sentimental about their instruments. Chapter 7. The Devoted. Miles Brant was 28 years old and had the look of a man who had spent his 20s reading instead of sleeping, which is an admirable quality in a writer and a concerning one in a suspect. I met him at a coffee shop near Columbia, a narrow place on Broadway with exposed brick and the smell of burned milk from the espresso machine. And he was already there when I arrived, sitting in a corner booth with a corduroy jacket and a notebook he closed when he saw me come in. The notebook had ink on the cover from a pen that had leaked. His right cuff had a stain of the same ink. His hands, when he moved them, and he moved them when he talked, in the particular way of a person who has spent enough time writing, that physical gesture and verbal expression have converged, were the hands of someone who worked with them, not in the carpentry sense, but in the sense of a person for whom the page is a physical object they engage with, rather than merely mark. He was nervous. Not guilty nervous, for I have interviewed enough people to know the difference. And the difference is in the specifics of what the nervousness does. Guilty nervous produces careful answers. Frightened of something else nervous produces careful answers about the wrong things. Miles was nervous about what I might ask, which told me he had a clear idea of what there was to be nervous about. But the nervousness was not the nervousness of someone managing a crime. It was the nervousness of someone who had been very private about something and was now watching privacy erode. I told him I was working for Nero Wolfe. I told him I was looking into Corwin Hale's literary estate. I watched his face when I said the name. It did what faces do when someone says the name of a person you've been missing for 2 years. Not quite grief, as the acute part of grief passes, but the shadow of it, the shape that grief leaves when it recedes. He said he had known Hale, that he had helped Hale organize some papers after the death, which was the same vague phrase everyone used when they meant something more specific and were not ready to say what. I said, "Published anything yourself?" A hesitation. Some small things, short fiction mostly. Anything in the last 2 years? A couple of novellas, very small press. R. Strand, I said. The hesitation this time was different in quality, more considered. He was weighing something. "How did you find that?" he said. A reporter at the Gazette read one of them. He thought it was good. I put my cup down. "What else did you help Corwin organize?" He looked at the table. He had a particular way of looking at things that were not people when he was deciding what to say, and the table was getting a great deal of his attention. "He asked me to," Miles said at last, "before he died. He was sick for longer than anyone knew. The heart was going, but slowly, and he had time to arrange things. He asked me to continue the work. The Vane series. Yes." I looked at him. "And you agreed?" He was the most talented person I'd ever met. He said this without apology, as a statement of fact. He had given those books his best work and nobody knew it. He had a sister who needed the income. He stopped. He cared about what happened to Miss Vane. He said she could write, but she didn't believe she could anymore. And that was his fault, for being too good at his job. He wanted me to bridge the gap, give her time to find her own footing again. He looked at me for the first time since the conversation had begun in earnest. "It was not supposed to go on this long," he said. "Why drop 30 pages of an unfinished book into her mailbox like a bomb?" Miles looked down at his ink-stained fingers. "Because she had stopped trying," he said, his voice dropping. 2 years went by. I sent the quarterly chapters through Frost's office under the old dummy imprint we used, and Adela simply accepted the checks and let the books roll out. She was comfortable. She had surrendered her own ambition to a dead man's ghost. I wanted to shake her awake. I wanted to force her to see that the words she was publishing weren't Corwin's anymore. They were mine, a stranger's, typed on a machine in Carroll Gardens. "Did you send a batch to Ruth Hale Connors, too?" "Ruth was demanding more money," Miles said bitterly. "She thought Corwin had left a secret trust. I sent her a chapter to remind her where the royalties actually came from." He looked at me with an expression that was half defiance, half exhaustion. "I am not a blackmailer, Mr. Goodwin," he said. "I am just a man who tried to keep a promise to a dead man, and discovered that ghosts are very expensive to maintain." I drove back to the brownstone and reported to Wolfe, who listened in complete silence. "He admits the mechanism," Wolfe said when I finished. "He admits the motive. Tomorrow morning, we assemble the proof." I went to bed that night thinking about a young man in Brooklyn who had spent 2 years typing someone else's career into existence. I was almost certain Wolfe needed Fritz. Chapter 8. Fritz Retyped It. Wolfe's breakfast, when he is in what Fritz calls working mode, is permitted at his desk. This is a concession Fritz makes twice a year, under protest, and documents privately as an exception, which I know because I have seen the notation in Fritz's household ledger under the heading "Deviations from Standard Practice." This was one of the days. Fritz had made eggs Benedict with a sauce that was not hollandaise. Fritz does not make hollandaise, which he considers a lazy shortcut. Instead, he prepares a tarragon reduction of dry sherry that he describes as appropriate for serious thought. The sauce was pale gold, pooling neatly at the edges of the poached eggs in a way that looked architectural rather than accidental. Wolfe ate without looking up from the manuscript pages laid out on his blotter, which meant he was eating by feel and memory, which is what happens when a man has eaten Fritz's cooking for 20 years. I sat across the desk with my coffee and said nothing, because when Wolfe is working and eating simultaneously, he is not available for conversation in any useful sense of the word. At 9:40, he said, "Fritz." Fritz appeared in the doorway with the timing of a man who has been listening from the kitchen, which he has, in his defense, always done. Wolfe said, "I want you to read this passage, once, silently, then close the pages and tell me what it says in your own words, without looking at it again." He handed Fritz page 12 of batch 2. Fritz read it. His face did nothing in particular while he read, which is Fritz's reading face, attentive but unrevealing. He handed the page back. He looked at the ceiling for a moment, composing himself. Then he said, "The auction room consists of 3 sections, each one different in its period, but not its purpose." "Thank you, Fritz," Wolfe said. "That will be all." Fritz left the room, wearing that particular look of quiet bewilderment he gets whenever a task makes complete sense in execution, but no sense at all in purpose. This is a state Wolfe produces in most people, including me, and it generally means he's right about something. I looked at the page, the original. "The auction room comprises 3 sections." I said. Fritz said "consists of." Naturally. Because Fritz has no trained habit, he paraphrased correctly. Wolfe folded his hands on the desk and looked at me. The person who wrote those pages used comprises. Not because they were careless, because they were trained to use it, and the training had become habit. And habits are not something a person can suspend simply by deciding to. I told you to note the word. I told you not to draw conclusions. I am now drawing one. I had my pad open. Miles Brandt. Mr. Brandt. Hale's letter to him, the carbon Saul recovered, instructs him specifically to use comprises as house style. The letter gives it as the reason, consistency with what Hale himself wrote. A person following that instruction, for 2 years, would use it without thinking. A person who had not received that instruction would not. Frost used it too. "Consider the psychology of the error, Archie," Wolfe said, setting his empty coffee cup onto the tray. "When an educated man acquires a grammatical solecism in youth, it becomes embedded in his cognitive architecture. He does not choose it, it chooses him. If he attempts to forge another man's style, he will consciously imitate their vocabulary and sentence length, but his own unconscious solecisms will inevitably assert themselves when his attention falters. But here, the inverse occurred. The writer did not slip into his own error. He executed Corwin Hale's error with mechanical, unswerving fidelity. That is not the work of a competitor attempting an imitation. It is the work of an apprentice following a canon. Frost spent years reading Hale's manuscripts. He absorbed it. He is not the sender, as his interest is the opposite. But he demonstrates the reach of Hale's habit into the people around him. Wolfe looked at the pages. What distinguishes Mr. Brandt is the combination. The word, the apartment, the postmark, the old character name, the metaphor from Miss Vane's first novel, which Hale had quoted in his letter to Miles as an example of Adela's authentic voice. Mr. Brandt would have read that letter many times. He would have absorbed that phrase the way Frost absorbed the word. I looked at my notes. Everything was there. Everything had been there since the first morning, in various places, waiting. He's not a criminal, I said. It came out differently than I expected. No, Wolfe agreed. He is a devoted young man who made a promise to a dying mentor and has been keeping it for 2 years at considerable personal cost. The fraud is real. The motive is not malice. He lifted his glass and took a slow swallow of Remmers, which makes this particular case more uncomfortable than the ones involving straightforward villainy. But it is what it is. He dictated. I called. Adela Vane, Edgar Frost, Vivian Dole, Ruth Hale Connors, Miles Brandt, the brownstone. The following evening at 6 o'clock. Wolfe would explain the matter in full. I made 5 calls. The first 3 agreed without significant pushback. Ruth Hale Connors required more persuasion, for she knew something was closing, and was not eager to be present when it did. Miles Brandt agreed immediately, which surprised me until I thought about it. He had been waiting to be found for some time, I thought, waiting for the thing to be named so that he could put it down. I hung up the last call. Wolfe was already reading something else. You knew this morning, I said. I suspected this morning. I knew when Fitz said, consists of. That's essentially the same thing. It is not, Mr. Goodwin. He turned a page. Suspicion is a direction. Knowledge is a destination. A man who knows his destination need not hurry. A man who only suspects it cannot afford to rest. He looked at me over the top of his book. Go to bed. Tomorrow will be a full evening. I went. I slept this time. Chapter 9. Everyone in the office. They arrived in the order I had expected. Frost first, because Frost considers punctuality a form of dominance. Vivian Dole close behind him, thin and precise, with the kind of stillness that comes from years of being the smartest person in a room and deciding not to mention it. Ruth Hale Connors third, who had a compact face and restless hands and the look of someone who had not slept well in several weeks. Adela last, because Adela had earned the right to arrive last in any room that was substantially about her. Miles Brandt arrived between Dole and Ruth Hale Connors. He took the chair nearest the bookcase and did not look at Adela when she came in, though I watched him not look at her with the particular effort of a person choosing not to do something rather than simply not doing it. I took my own chair. Wolfe sat behind his desk. The office at 6 in the evening has a particular quality. The lamplight from the standing lamp behind Wolfe's desk reaches the chairs in the center of the room, but not the walls, which gives the space the feeling of a theater where the audience is also the play. 5 people sat in 5 chairs, with the 6th chair mine. Wolfe sat behind his desk, like a magistrate who had agreed to settle a dispute he had not caused, did not particularly relish, but intended to resolve with absolute precision. He let the room settle. Then he said, "No one in this room has committed a crime of violence. I want to establish that clearly before I say anything else, because what I am about to say may sound in places as though it leads toward criminality, and I want you to know in advance that it does not. There is a fraud. There is an extended deception. There are guilty parties in various degrees. There is no victim who has been physically harmed. The law's interest in this matter is limited. Mine is not." Frost said, "Mr. Wolfe, if this is an attempt to embarrass Frost and Halliday—" "Frost," Wolfe said mildly, "you are here because your commercial interests are deeply entangled in this room, and because your silence for the past 6 years has bordered on actionable complicity. You will listen." Frost tightened his jaw and leaned back. "2 years ago," Wolfe continued, "Corwin Hale died of cardiac arrest in his apartment on West 50th Street. He had been ghostwriting for Miss Adela Vane for 6 years. 4 novels. He had been ill for longer than anyone knew, and in the months before his death, he arranged for the work to continue. He looked at Miles. He found a young writer of considerable talent, a man who had studied Hale's own published work and understood it from the inside, and he trained him. He gave him everything he needed: the typewriter, the apartment on Cornelia Street, the working notes, the correspondence with Miss Vane, the style guide he had assembled over 6 years of writing in her name. The room was very quiet. He also gave him an instruction about a specific word. The word comprises. Hale himself misused it, a trained error he had come to regard as house style, a consistency marker he believed would read as authenticity. He told the young man to use it. The young man complied. He has been complying for 2 years, and the habit is now his as thoroughly as it was Hale's. Miles Brant sat forward. "My name is Miles Brant," he said, his voice clear in the quiet room. "I wrote the pages. I sent the envelopes." "Tell them why," Wolfe said. Miles looked at Adela. "Corwin asked me to. He said Miss Vane had built her reputation on work that was half hers, and he was not going to let it collapse because he died at 54. He said she could write that she had always been able to write, but that she had stopped believing it because he had made it too easy for her. He wanted me to carry the series for 2 years and then force the issue so she would take back her own desk." Adela Vane stared at him. 4 books, she murmured. 4 years. Vivian Dole adjusted her glasses. "I suspected from the 3rd novel," she said calmly. The sentence structures tightened. The dialogue became more forensic. "I never asked, because Adela was earning 10% more every year, and an agent who asks questions that reduce her commission is in the wrong profession." Ruth Hale Connors dabbed at her eyes with a lace handkerchief. "Corwin told me I would be provided for. He said Miles was an honorable boy. I needed the checks for my sanatorium bills. Was I supposed to starve for an author's vanity?" Wolfe raised his hand. "Enough. The distribution of culpability is comprehensive. Mr. Frost suppressed the truth for profit. Miss Dole ignored it for commission. Miss Hale Connors accepted it for maintenance. Mr. Brant executed it out of misplaced filial devotion, and Miss Vane permitted it out of a failure of nerve." He looked directly at Adela Vane. "The question, Miss Vane, is not whether you have been wronged. You have been spared the labor of your own vocation while harvesting its rewards. The manuscript pages on your desk were not a threat. They were a mirror." Adela stood up. She did not look at Frost or Dole or Ruth. She looked at Miles Brant. "Did Corwin believe I could finish the silent docket alone?" she asked softly. Miles nodded once. He left a note in his desk. He wrote, "Adela has the compass. She only needs to be forced to steer." Adela looked at Wolfe. "Thank you, Mr. Wolfe. Mr. Goodwin, please send your final account to my bank." She turned, pulled her dark cashmere coat around her shoulders, and walked out into the hall. The front door closed with a firm, decisive latch. Kramer and Stebbins arrived 20 minutes later to take formal depositions regarding Ruth Hale Connors' complaint. As Wolfe had predicted, when Kramer realized there was no homicide, no blackmail, and only a tangle of copyright disputes, he slammed his notebook shut, warned Frost about deceptive trade practices, and left with Stebbins in a cloud of sour disgust. Miles Brant was the last to leave. He paused in the doorway and looked at me. "Is she going to write it?" he asked. "She's Adela Vane," I said. "Now she has to." He nodded, put his hands in his pockets, and stepped out into the rain. Chapter 10. The Last Word. The front door clicked shut behind Miles Brant, and the brownstone went abruptly, completely still, in the way a room does when 5 people who have spent an hour holding their breath finally take their air and their grievances somewhere else. It was 8:20. The office smelled of wet wool from the rain that had started around 7, stale tobacco from Frost's Panatella, a sharp floral perfume Vivienne Dole had worn like armor, and the faint, sweet smell of printer's ink that had clung to Miles Brant's corduroy cuffs. It was too many people for an office built for one sedentary genius and one working legman, and neither Wolfe nor I made any move to pretend otherwise. Wolfe pressed the buzzer twice. That was the signal for beer. Not the 1 buzz for Fritz to bring coffee, not the 3 buzz that meant an emergency in the front hall, but the deliberate, heavy double strike that meant the day's business was concluded and the digestive and intellectual machinery was officially shutting down. Fritz came in carrying a tray with 2 chilled bottles of Remmers and a tall glass of milk for me. He set the bottles beside Wolfe's right elbow, placed the milk on my blotter without a word, and gathered up the empty glasses and the heavy crystal ashtray that Frost had nearly filled with ash. Fritz looked at the ashtray with the profound, quiet sorrow of a man who considers tobacco smoke an insult to good upholstery, then turned and carried the tray back toward the kitchen. Wolfe uncapped the first bottle, poured with the slow, steady tilt that produces exactly 3/4 of an inch of foam, and drank half the glass in one long, unbroken draught. He closed his eyes, let his breath out through his nose, and settled back into the vast yellow chair that had been built by a cabinet maker in 1938 to accommodate his precise dimensions. "Satisfactory," he murmured. "If you like watching 5 people realize their lives are built on matchsticks," I said, leaning back and swiveling my chair toward him. Adela looked like she'd been hit with a sandbag wrapped in velvet. "Miss Vane," Wolfe said, not opening his eyes, "suffered from a delusion common among people of moderate creative capacity. She believed that because she could not master the mechanics of execution, the conception itself was fraudulent. It is a fallacy. An architect does not lay the bricks, he designs the foundation. Her error was not in employing Mr. Hale to construct the edifice. Her error lay in permitting herself to forget that she had drawn the plans." "She's still out $500 for our retainer," I said, "plus whatever Frost's lawyers and Ruth Hale Connor's attorneys decide to carve out of the back royalties. And she's got a half-finished book on her desk that she doesn't know how to type." "She knows how to type," Wolfe said, his eyes still closed. "She has possessed a typewriter for 30 years. What she lacked was the audacity to fail in her own voice. Deprived now of an invisible surrogate, she will discover a simple truth. Failing in her own voice is far better than succeeding in someone else's." I looked across the room at the small side table beneath the engraving of Brillat-Savarin. Saul had brought Corwin Hale's old portable Royal in from Brooklyn that afternoon, wrapped in a gray wool blanket. It sat there now, its black enamel casing dull under the lamplight, the carriage locked, the faded ribbon spool visible through the top slots. A machine of stamped steel, springs, and rubber rollers. It had no opinions about literature. It had a worn type bar for the letter E that struck 2 millimeters below the baseline, and a tilted letter T that threw a faint smudge to the northeast of every consonant. For 6 years it had hammered out sentences that millions of readers had bought on newsstands and in railway stations, believing they were listening to a refined lady barrister from Dorset, when they were actually listening to a tired man with a bad heart eating sardines out of a tin on West 50th Street. "What happens to Miles Brant?" I asked. "Nothing of a penal nature," Wolfe said. "Mr. Kramer will file his report under miscellaneous civil complaints and forget it within 48 hours. Frost will threaten litigation to preserve his dignity, discover that a public trial would reduce the value of the Ravenswood copyright to zero, and quietly negotiate a private settlement with Mr. Brandt and Miss Hale Connors. Mr. Brandt will continue to write for Cormorant Press. In 5 years, if he has the stamina, he will publish under his own name. If he does not, he will find another patron. He thought he was being noble, I said. He was being faithful, Wolfe corrected. The distinction is vital. Nobility requires an ethical principle. Fidelity requires only an object of devotion. Mr. Brandt loved Corwin Hale. To a young man of literary ambition, the instruction of an elder practitioner is sacred. When Mr. Hale commanded him to sustain the illusion, he obeyed not out of venality, but out of reverence. It is the most dangerous form of compliance, Mr. Goodwin, because it wears the garments of virtue. The telephone on my desk rang. I picked it up on the second ring, said, "Nero Wolfe's office, Archie Goodwin speaking," and heard the familiar, low, lazy drawl of Lily Rowan coming across the line from her apartment on Park Avenue. "Archie," she said, "are you covered in blood, or can you take me to the Flamingo for a steak?" "No blood," I said, glancing at Wolfe, who had opened one eye to glare at the telephone. "Only ink, gallons of it. Every writer in Manhattan just had their pedigree checked, and nobody came back purebred." "Did the fat man solve it?" "He told 5 people their grammar was atrocious and charged them for the privilege. He's currently drinking his weight in malt." "Come get me at 9, she said. "I've spent the afternoon with 3 women from the Junior League who think mystery novels are vulgar, and I need you to explain a blunt instrument to me. I have to wash the smell of publisher out of my hair." She laughed and hung up. I put the receiver down and looked at my pad. I drew a neat line through the name Adela Vane, another through Frost and Halliday, and a third through 447 Cornelia Street. The desk was clear. The notebook was full. In the morning I would type the final bill, deduct Saul's per diem and Fred's expenses, and deposit the remainder in the Chase National account on 34th Street. Wolfe had picked up his book again, a thick volume on the botany of the Andes. He turned a page with a dry, papery scrape that sounded remarkably like the feed roller of a typewriter. "Mr. Goodwin." "Yes, sir." "Leave the Royal on the table tonight. Fritz will box it for Mr. Brandt in the morning." "Right. And tell Fritz that tomorrow's squab should be roasted with sage, not rosemary. The rosemary was assertive yesterday." "I'll break the news gently," I said. "He may need a sedative." I got up, turned off the green-shaded desk lamp and walked out into the hall. Down the hallway, through the half-open door of the kitchen, I could see Fritz standing by the butcher block, carefully drying a copper saucepan with a linen towel. The light in the kitchen was warm and yellow, smelling of sweet butter, dried thyme, and simmering stock. In a city where 6 million people were constantly trying to rewrite themselves into something richer, louder, or more famous than they were, Fritz Brenner spent 18 hours a day perfecting a consommé that would disappear in 10 minutes. It seemed to me, standing in the dark hallway with the rain ticking against the glass of the front door, that Fritz had the better idea. I stood there for another minute, looking at the black Royal typewriter under the amber glow of the desk lamp. In a city like New York, there are thousands of people walking the avenues who live inside names they didn't inherit, and reputations they didn't entirely build. Some of them are frauds, some of them are cowards, and some of them are just people who found the world too loud and the market too demanding to face without a mask. Corwin Hale had built a mask so durable that even death couldn't crack it. It had taken a young man with an ink-stained cuff and too much devotion to bring it down. I took my raincoat off the hook, checked my tie in the mirror by the door, and stepped out into the October night. Behind me, in the brownstone, the lights stayed on, and there it is. A brownstone on West 35th Street. An old royal typewriter with worn, misaligned keys, and a story about what happens when a name becomes larger and heavier than the person who has to carry it. I've been thinking about Adela Vane all evening, about that moment in Wolfe's office when she looked at 5 years of bestsellers and had to ask herself who had actually written the life she was living. I don't think that's a small question, and I don't think it belongs only to mystery novelists. We all borrow voices when our own feel too thin. We all lean on someone else's courage until we forget where their words end and ours begin. The question I asked you at the beginning, if someone writes the book that makes you who you are, is the name on the cover a lie? I am curious if hearing what happened to Adela and Miles changed how you see it. Tell me in the comments. I read every single one, and I want to know where you draw the line between collaboration and surrender. If Midnight Pages is where you come for a good mystery and a quiet hour at the end of the day, I'm glad you're here. Subscribe if you haven't yet, so the next case finds its way to your desk the moment it's ready. There are more coming. There always are. This is David. Good night from Ohio. Whatever you put your name to tonight, may it be written in your own voice.